The wind had teeth, and it was chewing on the world. It came down from the high peaks of the Bighorns with a fury that scoured the land bare, peeling the last dead leaves from the cottonwoods and driving the snow into a solid, blinding wall of white. Thane pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat tighter around his neck, the frozen wool scratching against the grain of his beard. He could feel the cold, not as a sensation, but as a presence, a living thing that sought the heat in his bones. It was a predator, and this storm was its hunting ground. He had lived in its territory for 20 years, and while he had learned its habits, he had never lost his respect for its power. It was a power that had taken everything from him once before, and he never let himself forget it. He moved along the fence line, his gloved hands checking the tension of the wire, his eyes scanning the impenetrable white for the dark shapes of his cattle. They were hardy stock, bred for this unforgiving climate, and they would likely be huddled in the lee of the rock formations to the south, their backs to the wind. Still, a steer could get turned around, lost in the maelstrom, and wander until it froze on its feet. It was a fool's errand to be out in this, but the ranch was his only ledger, and every head of cattle was a line item he could not afford to lose. The crunch of his boots on the wind-scoured snow was the only sound besides the ceaseless howl of the gale. The world had been reduced to this: the biting cold, the shrieking wind, and the heavy, rhythmic labor of his own heart. It was a flicker of color that caught his eye, a smudge of dark red against the overwhelming white, 50 yards out from his fence. It was wrong. Nothing grew out here in the winter but gray sagebrush and the skeletal arms of rabbit brush, all of it buried now. He paused, his breath pluming and freezing instantly in the air. He squinted, the wind driving ice crystals into his face like needles. It was not a rock or a bush. It had the soft, slumped shape of a body, perhaps a deer caught by a wolf pack, or a coyote that had misjudged the storm's ferocity. But the color was still wrong. It was the deep, worn crimson of dyed cloth. A grim knot tightened in his gut. No man had any business being out here this far from the trail, especially not in a blizzard that had swallowed the sun for 2 days straight. He changed course, leaning into the wind, his boots sinking deeper into the gathering drifts. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a person, small and huddled, almost completely buried in a fresh drift that had formed against their still form. They were lying on their side, curled into a tight ball against the impossible cold. He saw the crimson fabric of a thin tunic, a garment wholly unfit for this country, its silk threads a mockery of the storm's raw power. He reached the body and knelt, his knees cracking in protest. He brushed the snow away from a face the color of bleached bone. It was a woman. Her hair, a sheet of polished black ice, was frozen to the ground. Her eyes were closed, her lips a faint, bloodless blue. She was Chinese, her features fine and delicate, now sharpened by the cruel hand of starvation and cold. And then he saw the swell of her belly beneath the thin, inadequate layers of her clothing. She was not just a woman. She was a mother carrying a life that was moments away from being extinguished along with her own. For a long moment, Thane did nothing. He just knelt there, the wind tearing at him, the past rising up like a ghost from the snow. He saw another woman, her face pale with effort, her body lost in a sea of quilts, inside this very same cabin. He heard the thin, weak cry of a newborn, a sound that had been silenced almost as soon as it began, followed by a deeper, more profound silence that had never truly left him. The storm had taken his Sarah and his infant son Daniel 10 winters ago. It had been a blizzard just like this one, sealing them in, sealing their fate. And now it had brought him this. Another woman, another child, on the brink of the same abyss. He looked at the woman's still face, at the impossible burden she carried. The indifferent world would let her die here. The snow would cover her, and in the spring the coyotes would find what was left. It was the way of things. The mountain gave, and the mountain took. But something inside him, a stubborn, buried coal of defiance that had not been extinguished by a decade of grief, refused to let it happen. He would not let the storm win again, not this time. He worked with a grim efficiency that was devoid of sentiment. His movements were sure and practiced, honed by years of solitary work. He slid his arms beneath the woman's body, surprised by how little she weighed. Even with the child inside her, she was a bundle of sticks and frozen cloth. He lifted her, his muscles groaning under the strain. She was a dead weight, her head lolling back against his shoulder. He thought for a second. He was too late, that he was merely carrying a corpse back to his cabin for a proper burial. But then he felt it a flicker of warmth, a shallow, almost imperceptible puff of breath against the frozen leather of his coat. She was alive. The knowledge settled in him not as relief, but as a heavy, undeniable responsibility. He grunted, adjusting her weight in his arms, and turned his back to the wind. The cabin was a quarter-mile away, an eternity in this blinding gale. He lowered his head and began the long walk back, each step a battle against the wind and the drifts that clutched at his legs. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. The offer was the act itself, the warmth of his body, the strength in his arms, the steady, determined march toward shelter. This was his intervention, a silent, practical refusal to surrender another life to the winter. The woman in his arms was a ghost. She drifted in and out of a shallow, shivering consciousness. At times she was aware of movement, a jolting, swaying rhythm. She felt a strength around her that was not her own, a solid wall of warmth against her back that seemed to be fighting back the all-consuming cold. The world was a blur of white, a roaring in her ears. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were heavy, caked with ice. There was a scent of wood smoke, of wet wool and pine, a masculine scent of earth and labor. It was safe. That was the only thought that managed to form in the frozen landscape of her mind. Safe. She remembered walking. She remembered the world turning white and the path disappearing. She remembered her husband, Leanne, his face in her mind, his promise of a life in the golden mountains of America. That promise had turned to dust. Just like him, buried in a rock slide on the railroad grade weeks ago. She was left with nothing but his debt and the child growing within her, a child he would never see. The man who owned the debt, a cruel man with eyes like chips of slate, had cast her out when he learned of Leanne's death. She had been walking toward another settlement, a place she had been told might have work, when the storm had descended. Now this strange floating salvation. She managed a weak, fluttering grasp, her frozen fingers clinging to the rough sheepskin of the coat that enveloped her. It was the only acceptance she could offer, a silent plea and a flicker of trust in the faithless stranger who was carrying her out of the white oblivion. Thane felt the faint pressure against his chest and tightened his grip. He did not look down at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the vague dark shape in the distance that he knew was his cabin, a sanctuary he had built with his own hands, a place that had been more tomb than home for 10 long years. The cabin door groaned in protest as he kicked it open, a cloud of snow and wind chasing him inside. He shouldered the door, shut the latch, falling into place with a heavy final thud. The sudden silence was immense, broken only by the crackle of the embers in the stone fireplace and the ragged sound of his own breathing. The air inside was cool, but still, a world away from the violence outside. He carried the woman across the worn plank floor and gently laid her on his own bed, a simple frame of pine covered with a thick buffalo robe. His home was a reflection of his life, Spartan, functional, and stripped of all comfort that was not essential for survival. A single wooden table and a chair stood in the center of the room. A cast-iron stove was cold in the corner, its surface clean shelves. On the wall held a few tin plates, a handful of books with cracked spines, and neatly stacked tins of beans and flour. There was no color, no softness, no sign that a woman had ever lived here. The only evidence of his past was a small, crudely carved wooden bird that sat on the mantelpiece, its paint faded, a toy he had made for a son who had never had the chance to hold it. He moved without wasted motion, stoking the embers in the fireplace, adding kindling, and then larger logs until a proper fire was roaring, its light pushing back the grey gloom of the storm. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on the hearth to warm. He gently worked the frozen boots from the woman's feet, his fingers clumsy against the delicate, unfamiliar fastenings. Her feet were numb and white, on the verge of frostbite. He chafed them briskly with his rough hands, forcing the blood back into them, ignoring the small, pained sound she made. She was watching him through slitted eyes, her gaze clouded with confusion and fear. He did not meet her eyes. He was a man unused to the presence of another, let alone a woman in such a desperate state. He felt a profound awkwardness, a sense of intrusion into the sterile solitude he had cultivated for so long. He was a doctor to a wounded animal, his actions driven by a sense of duty, not tenderness. He worked on her as he would a sick calf, his focus on the practicalities of survival. When the water was warm, he soaked rags in it and began to clean her face, washing away the grime and the ice. Her skin was smooth beneath his calloused fingers. He found a clean, worn wool shirt of his own, and with as much modesty as he could manage, removed her frozen, damp tunic and wrapped her in the thick, dry wool. It swallowed her small frame, the sleeves hanging far past her hands. He pulled the buffalo robe up to her chin and then retreated to the other side of the room, putting the table between them. He sat in his single chair, watching her, listening to the sound of her shallow breathing, mingling with the hiss and pop of the fire. The storm raged outside, a wild beast trying to claw its way in, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace had settled. He had brought a stranger into his sanctuary, a life into his tomb. He did not know her name or her story, or what he would do with her when the storm passed. He only knew that for the first time in a decade he was not entirely alone, and the knowledge was as unsettling as it was profound. For 3 days the blizzard held them captive. The world beyond the cabin walls ceased to exist, buried under a thick blanket of snow and sound. Inside, a quiet rhythm began to establish itself. Thane moved with the familiar patterns of his solitary life, tending the fire, melting snow for water, preparing his simple, tasteless meals of salted pork and hardtack. But now every action was shadowed by the presence of the woman in his bed. Her name, he learned on the second day, was May. She spoke it in a voice that was barely a whisper, a dry, rustling sound. Her English was broken, pieced together from a small collection of carefully chosen words. She told him, in fragmented sentences, of her husband, Lien, and the railroad. She spoke of a debt and a cruel man, a Mr. Croft, whose name she said with a tremor of fear. Thane listened without comment, his face an unreadable mask. He understood more than she said. He had seen men like Croft before, men who built their fortunes on the backs of others, men who saw people as entries in a ledger. May recovered her strength slowly. On the third day she was able to sit up, wrapped in his wool shirt and a blanket. He watched him with large, dark eyes that held a depth of sorrow he recognized. While he was outside clearing a path to the woodpile, she rose from the bed, her movements slow and deliberate. When he returned, stamping the snow from his boots, he found she had folded the blankets on the bed with a precision that was almost military. She had taken the tin plates from his breakfast and washed them, stacking them neatly on the shelf. She had swept the floor with a makeshift broom she had fashioned from a bundle of dry twigs. A silent communication began to flow between them, a language of actions rather than words. He would leave a bucket of water by the stove, and she would use it to wash, her back turned to him in a posture of quiet dignity. He would bring in a rabbit he had snared, and she would prepare it with herbs she found in a small cloth bag she carried, transforming his bland fare into a savory, aromatic stew. He noticed her mending one of his shirts, her stitches so fine and even, they were nearly invisible. She was bringing order and a strange quiet beauty to his stark existence. He found himself watching her. He watched the way her slender fingers worked the needle, the way she moved about the small space with an economy of motion that matched his own. She never complained, never spoke of her fear or her loss beyond that first brief explanation. She carried her grief with a resilience that humbled him. In her he saw not a fragile victim, but a survivor, a woman of immense inner strength who had been dealt a terrible hand and was still determined to play it. One afternoon he returned from checking his livestock to find her standing by the small grimy window, looking out at the endless white tears were tracking silently down her cheeks. She did not make a sound, but her shoulders shook with a grief so profound it seemed to fill the room. He stopped in the doorway, feeling like an intruder. He did not know how to offer comfort. The words had died in him long ago, along with his wife. He turned and went back outside, chopping wood with a ferocity that was born of helplessness. He worked until his shoulders ached and sweat froze on his brow, the rhythmic thud of the axe a counterpoint to the silent sorrow in his cabin. When he finally went back inside, she was sitting at the table, her face composed, her hands folded in her lap. The tears were gone. She looked at him and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude for his unspoken understanding, for giving her the privacy to grieve. He nodded back, and in that simple exchange, a new level of understanding was reached. They were two solitary souls, each carrying their own burden of loss, now sharing a small space of warmth against the cold, indifferent world. The second storm arrived a month later, a white wolf slinking down from the peaks, more savage than the first. It came without warning, turning a day of pale sunshine into a maelstrom of blinding snow. By then May was heavy with child, her movements slow and labored. A fragile domesticity had settled over the cabin. She had fashioned curtains from an old flour sack, stitched a cushion for his hard chair, and the scent of baking bread often filled the small space. Thane had found himself speaking more, telling her the names of the birds that came to the window, explaining the way the seasons turned in these mountains. He had even one evening shown her the small wooden bird on the mantel, and spoken his son's name, Daniel, in a low, rough voice. The crisis began just after dusk. May gasped a sharp, sudden intake of breath, her hands flying to her swollen belly. She looked at Thane, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and inevitability. The child was coming. Outside, the wind screamed like a banshee, piling snow against the door, sealing them in. There would be no fetching a doctor from the settlement, even if there had been one to fetch. They were alone, trapped at the mercy of the storm and the primal, unforgiving forces of life and death. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over Thane. He was back in that other room 10 years ago, the air thick with the scent of blood and fear. He saw Sarah's face, pale and slick with sweat, her eyes pleading with him to do something, anything. He had been helpless then, a clumsy, terrified man watching the two people he loved most in the world slip away from him now. He was being asked to stand vigil at that same precipice again. His first instinct was to flee, to run out into the storm and let it take him, to escape this impossible echo of his greatest failure. But he looked at May, at the raw courage in her face, the resolute set of her jaw. She was preparing for a battle, and her quiet strength shamed his fear. He saw her glance at him, a flicker of trust in her dark eyes, and he knew he could not fail her. He forced his own ghosts down, locking them away in the iron box in his chest. He moved to the hearth, his actions deliberate and steady, and began to boil water. He was no midwife, but he was a rancher. He had helped birth calves and foals in difficult circumstances. He knew the basics of it, the grim and bloody business of new life. The night became a blur of strained vigil. The cabin was a small, flickering island of light in an ocean of roaring darkness. He and May worked together, a silent, desperate team. He supported her when the pains racked her body, his strong, steady presence a rock for her to cling to. He spoke to her in a low, soothing murmur, the words themselves unimportant, the tone everything. She, in turn, fought with a strength that astonished him, her small body a vessel of incredible power. There were moments when he thought he would lose her, when her strength seemed to fade and her breathing grew shallow. In those moments, his own past threatened to overwhelm him, the memory of Sarah's final, exhausted sigh. It was in the darkest hour, just before the false dawn, when she seemed to be slipping away. Her eyes were closed, her face as white as the snow outside. Her breath was a faint whisper. He leaned close, his heart a cold stone in his chest, believing he was about to lose her. She opened her eyes, her gaze finding his. Her lips moved, forming words so quiet he could barely hear them over the wind. "Promise him," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "A good name." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. In that desperate moment, her own life hanging by a thread, she was not thinking of herself. She was thinking of her child, of his future, a future she might not be there to see. And she was entrusting that future, that most fundamental piece of a person's identity, to him. A stranger, a man she had known for barely a month. That simple, profound act of trust shattered the walls he had built around his heart for a decade. he felt a cracking deep inside him, a fissure in the frozen landscape of his soul. He saw not just May, but Sarah. He felt not just the impending loss of this new life, but the raw, unhealed wound of his own son's death. The two moments, a decade apart, merged into one unbearable point of agony and grace. He knelt by the bed, his head bowed, and for the first time since he had buried his wife and child, Thane wept. Hot, silent tears cut paths through the grime on his face. He wept for his loss, for her pain, for the brutal, beautiful, and terrible fragility of life. His tears, perhaps, or some shift in the tide of her battle seemed to call her back. She grunted, her body arching, a new wave of energy surging through her. And then, with a final primal cry that was lost in the shriek of the wind, the child was born. A boy, small, bloody, and miraculously alive, his thin, angry wail cutting through the heavy air of the cabin. Thane, his face still wet with tears, moved on instinct, cleaning the child, wrapping him in a clean piece of wool, and placing him in his mother's arms. May, exhausted but radiant, held her son, her eyes luminous in the firelight. The storm still raged, but inside the cabin the battle was over. A new life had begun, and Thane knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that his own life had begun again as well. The spring thaw came late that year, a slow, grudging retreat of the snow that revealed a world washed clean. The creeks swelled with meltwater, and the first green shoots of grass pushed their way through the muddy earth. Life had returned to the high country. Inside the cabin, a new kind of life had taken root. The baby whom May had simply called Bow, or Treasure, was healthy and strong. His presence had transformed the small space, filling it with the small sounds and routines of infancy. Thane found himself irrevocably altered. The grief he had carried like a shroud had not vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer an active, crushing weight, but a quiet, settled sorrow, a part of the landscape of his past. The future, which for so long had been a barren, featureless plain, now held a single point of light: the woman and child who had taken refuge in his home. He worked his ranch with a renewed purpose, his days defined not just by the needs of his cattle, but by the desire to provide and protect the small family that now lived under his roof. One afternoon in late May, he saw two riders approaching from the east. It was the first sign of the outside world they had seen in months. He watched them from the porch, his hand resting on the axe handle that was propped against the wall. As they drew closer, he recognized one of them. It was Silas Croft, the owner of the mining concern in the next valley, a man whose reputation was as hard and unyielding as the rock his men blasted from the mountainside. The man beside him was one of his hired thugs, a broad-shouldered man with a brutish face. Croft reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his eyes sweeping over the property with a look of undisguised contempt. He was a man dressed in fine city clothes that looked absurdly out of place against the raw backdrop of the wilderness. He dismounted, his polished boots sinking into the soft mud. "I'm looking for a woman," Croft said, his voice clipped and arrogant. He did not bother with greetings. "A Chinese woman. She was indentured to me. Her husband, a laborer, died owing me a significant sum. The contract stipulated his property, including his wife, as collateral." Thane remained silent, his expression unchanging. He did not move from his position on the porch, his body a solid, immovable obstacle in front of the cabin door. Behind him, He could hear May moving, a soft rustle of cloth as she retreated further into the shadows of the room, clutching her baby to her chest. I heard she was seen heading this way before the first snows, Croft continued, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. The contract is legally binding in this territory. She belongs to me, along with any issue. He gestured dismissively toward the cabin. Hand her over, and I'll be on my way. I have no quarrel with you, rancher. Thane's eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on Croft. He thought of May's terror when she had spoken this man's name. He thought of her quiet dignity, her tireless work to make this place a home. He thought of the child sleeping inside, a child born into a world that would see him as property, as a line item in a rich man's ledger. The cold, quiet rage that had been banked inside him for years began to smolder. Croft saw the stillness in Thane's face and mistook it for hesitation. "Look, I am a reasonable man," he said, his tone shifting to one of false magnanimity. "I know this is a hard country. Let's not make it any harder. You give me what is mine, and I will forget you harbored my property. Refuse, and I will use every ounce of my influence to see that your land claim is challenged, your credit in town is revoked, and you are run out of this valley with nothing but the clothes on your back. The choice is yours." The ultimatum hung in the quiet air, heavy and poisonous. It was the casual tyranny of the powerful, the belief that everything and everyone had a price. Thane's gaze did not waver. He looked past Croft to the mountains that stood silent and eternal against the horizon. He had lost everything once. He was not afraid of losing things again, but he would not lose his soul. He slowly straightened up from his lean, his full height seeming to fill the porch. He took a step forward, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the wooden planks. "No," he said. The word was not shouted. It was a simple, quiet statement of fact, as solid and immovable as the granite peaks behind him. It was a declaration that carried the weight of his entire life, of his grief, his solitude, and his newfound purpose. Croft's face darkened with fury. "You dare defy me? Do you know who I am?" "I know what you are," Thane replied, his voice still low, but now with an edge of cold steel. "Her husband is dead. Any contract he signed died with him. She is on my land now, under my protection. This conversation is over. Get off my property." He took another step forward, and this time he picked up the axe, its weight familiar and reassuring in his hand. He did not raise it as a weapon. He simply held it. The gesture was enough. Croft, hired man, shifted uneasily in his saddle. Croft, his face a mask of rage, saw the absolute, unshakable resolve in Thane's eyes. He knew he would get nothing more here today, not without a fight he was not prepared for. "This is not over, rancher," Croft snarled, backing away toward his horse. "You will regret this." He mounted his horse, yanked viciously on the reins, and galloped away, his hired man trailing behind him. Thane stood on the porch, watching them until they were small specks in the distance. He did not relax until they were gone. He let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and turned to go back inside. May was standing just inside the doorway, her face pale, the baby held tightly in her arms. Her eyes were fixed on his, and in them he saw not fear, but a fierce, shining gratitude that was more eloquent than any words could ever be. 2 weeks later, Croft returned. This time, he was not accompanied by a hired thug, but by Sheriff Miller from the settlement. The sheriff was a man whose spine was as flexible as his income required, and Thane knew that Croft's money had purchased the law for the day. They rode up to the cabin, and Miller, looking uncomfortable, dismounted. "Thane," the sheriff began, avoiding his eyes, "Mr. Croft here has filed a formal complaint. He has a contract signed by the woman's husband. It appears to be legal. It makes a claim on her person as collateral for a debt." Thane had been expecting this. He had spent the last 2 weeks preparing for it, though he did not know what form his preparations would take. He had simply settled the matter in his own mind. He stepped out onto the porch. This time May came out with him, standing not behind him, but beside him. She held the baby, wrapped in a clean blanket, and her back was straight, her chin high. "That contract is an abomination," Thane said, his voice level. "It is a slave document, and it has no place in this territory." "The law is the law," Miller mumbled, clearly parroting a line Croft had fed him. "My hands are tied. I have a writ here to take possession of Mr. Croft's property." He held up a piece of paper, the official seal of the territory visible at the bottom. Croft smiled, a triumphant, predatory expression. "It is all perfectly legal. Now, stand aside." Thane looked not at Croft, but at the sheriff. He saw the weakness and the shame in the man's eyes. He knew he had to give him a reason, a way out that would satisfy the letter of the law, if not its spirit. He had thought about this moment over and over in the long, quiet nights. "You can't take her, Sheriff," Thane said calmly, "and you can't take the boy." "And why is that?" Croft sneered. "Are you her new owner?" Thane ignored him, his gaze locked on Miller. "Because she is not some piece of property from a dead man's contract. She is family." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. Then he delivered the final decisive blow. "The child is my son." A shocked silence fell over the small clearing. Croft's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of disbelief. Sheriff Miller's jaw went slack. The lie was audacious, impossible, yet Thane spoke it with the simple, unadorned force of gospel truth. Before anyone could challenge him, May spoke. Her voice was clear and steady, her carefully learned English ringing with an unexpected eloquence. "My husband, Leanne, he knew he was dying. He made me promise," he said, "find a good man, a strong man to be a father to our son. He sent me to this man." She looked at Thane, her expression one of utter conviction. "He told me to make our child this man's blood. It was his last wish." The story was a fabrication woven from desperation and dignity, but it was delivered with such sincerity that it created its own reality. It was a story the sheriff could understand. A dying man's wish, the protection of a woman and child, the sanctity of blood and family. These powerful concepts on the frontier, often more powerful than a piece of paper held by a wealthy outsider. Croft, sputtering with rage, saw his legal high ground crumbling beneath him. "This is absurd. They are lying. She's a—" He took a step forward, his hand raised as if to strike her. In a motion so swift, it was almost a blur, Thane moved between them. He did not draw a weapon. He simply planted his feet and caught Croft's arm in a grip of iron. With a single powerful twist, he threw the smaller man off the porch. Croft landed in a heap in the mud, his fine clothes ruined, his dignity shattered. The hired man had made no move to help his employer. He just watched, his face impassive. Sheriff Miller looked from the humiliated Croft to the unmovable figure of Thane, and then to the proud, defiant woman and the child she held. He had his way out. This was no longer a simple matter of enforcing a contract. It was a domestic dispute, a question of parentage. "Well," the sheriff said, clearing his throat and stuffing the writ back into his coat, "it seems this is a family matter. Now paternity will have to be established by the circuit judge." He knew, and everyone there knew, the circuit judge only came through twice a year, and he had no interest in getting involved in something so messy. "Mr. Croft, I suggest you leave these people be until the judge can sort it out." It was a clear victory for Thane. The sheriff was washing his hands of the affair. Croft, covered in mud and shaking with impotent fury, knew he had been beaten. He had been outmaneuvered, not by law or by violence, but by a lie that held a deeper truth. He had lost face, and in this small insular world, that was a defeat from which he would not easily recover. He climbed to his feet, shot a look of pure hatred at Thane, and stormed over to his horse without another word. The sheriff, looking relieved, tipped his hat awkwardly and followed. Thane and May stood together on the porch, watching them ride away for the second and final time. The threat was gone. The quiet of the valley descended once more, broken only by the soft cooing of the baby in May's arms. In the weeks that followed, a new peace settled over the homestead. Deeper and more permanent than before, the confrontation with Croft had changed things. It had forged their shared lies into a shared truth. They were, in the eyes of the world, and now, in their own hearts, a family. When Thane went into the settlement for supplies, he found the atmosphere had shifted. Henderson, the store owner, who had previously been curt and professional, now greeted him with a nod of grudging respect. News of the confrontation had spread. Thane had stood up to Silas Croft, and on the frontier, standing your ground against a powerful man, earned you a certain kind of reputation. The days fell into a comfortable, easy rhythm. They worked together, their partnership now cemented in trust and a quiet, unspoken affection. He taught her how to tend a garden, his large, calloused hands gentle as he showed her how to press the seeds into the dark, rich earth. She, in turn, transformed the interior of the cabin from a stark shelter into a warm, welcoming home. She planted wildflowers in tins on the windowsill, and their color. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the silence of strangers navigating an awkward proximity, but the comfortable, easy silence of two people who understood each other without the need for words. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the alpenglow paint the mountain peaks in shades of rose and violet, the baby sleeping soundly in a cradle Thane had fashioned from a hollowed log. One such evening, as the last light of the day faded from the sky, Thane turned to her. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. "May," he began, his voice rough with a rare emotion, "that day with Croft, what I said, what we said, I want to make it true." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face in the twilight. "You asked me to promise your son a good name," he continued, his gaze steady. "I was thinking, Samuel. It's a strong name, a good name." He paused and then added, "Samuel Thane. If you'll have it, if you'll have me." He finally spoke his own given name to her. "My name is Thane." It was not a declaration of flowery passion, but something deeper, quieter, and more profound. It was an offer of a home, of protection, of a name for her son. It was the offering of his whole life, the the broken pieces and the newly healed parts, all of it laid before her. May looked at this quiet, stoic man who had saved her from the storm, who had delivered her child, who had wept for her, and who had stood against a powerful enemy for her honor and her freedom. She saw the years of loneliness and grief in the lines around his eyes, but she also saw a deep well of kindness and an unshakable strength. In his stark, lonely cabin, she had found the one thing she thought she had lost forever. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, the first true unguarded smile he had ever seen from her. It lit up her features, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but certain. Samuel is a very good name. Thane felt a lifetime of tension release from his shoulders. He reached out, his hand covering hers, where it rested on the arm of her chair. Her fingers were small but strong, and they curled around his, a perfect fit. They sat there for a long time, hand in hand, as the stars began to appear in the vast, dark sky. Everything that needed to be said had been said in the quiet language of shared survival, of mutual respect, and of a love that had taken root and grown, strong and resilient, in the heart of the harshest winter. The small cabin, once a monument to his grief, was now a beacon of hope, a tiny, defiant point of light and warmth against the vast, wild, and beautiful frontier. A family had been born from the storm, and their new beginning was as promising as the sunrise that would soon crest the mountains.